The Sunday School lesson for June 7th is Accept Your Leadership Role. This is the beginning of a series entitled Be Strong and Courageous, Everyday Leadership from Joshua. This series will run through July 12th. The emphasis of this series is that everyone is a leader in some area of life. In Joshua, we find an example of a godly leader. The main point of today's lesson is, as you lead, submit to God's authority and direction. The focal passage for the lesson is Joshua chapter 1, verses 1 through 9. The first 5 books of the Bible are known as the books of Moses. In Hebrew, they are called the Torah. Tradition teaches that Moses wrote the majority of the first 5 books. The only parts that he didn't write were the parts where it says, and Moses died. He couldn't write those, but someone after him, the person who was charged with preserving the text, finished what Moses had started. But the majority is written by Moses. And the first 5 books tells us the story of the creation of the world and humanity. We also learn of how sin entered into the world and its tragic effects. The story moves from a global perspective down to one man, Abram. Abraham, his son Isaac, and his grandson Jacob were called out by God and given a promise. And that promise was renewed with each generation. They would become the fathers of 12 tribes that would become a nation, and this nation would be blessed. It would would number like the sand on the seashore and the stars of the sky. Not able to count it. They would have so many descendants. And not only that, but they would be a blessing to all of humanity. The entire promise is given in Genesis chapter 12, and it's repeated several times through Genesis. But that's the story that's told, and then we're told how those 12 tribes went down to Egypt and became a nation. They were oppressed and enslaved, and God delivered them from Egypt using Moses. God called Moses to bring the Hebrews out of Egypt and lead them to the promised land. Now, Moses did not leap at the job, but actually tried to pass it off. When you read Exodus, you see Moses was a reluctant leader. He had initially tried to free the Hebrews through violence, and that didn't work. He was forced to flee as an exile from Egypt. And he gave up on helping his brothers because he had done it his way and failed. But God called Moses and told him, you're going to be the man who delivers my people, and you'll guide them to the promised land that I promised to Abraham. And Moses said, I am the wrong man. And he argues with God, but finally he relents. But throughout his career, Moses was not always thrilled with his leadership role, and many times said to God, why don't you find somebody else? But God constantly told Moses, you're the man, don't worry, I will be with you. And Moses was obedient. Even though he was reluctant to be a leader, he was obedient to God and was a very good leader. The people often rejected Moses, even though he was called by God. They rejected his guidance and rebelled. And their rebellion ultimately led to punishment, as that generation was condemned to die in the wilderness, and their children were given the inheritance of the promised land. The book of Deuteronomy, the last book of Moses, ends with the second generation ready to enter into the promised land. The first generation that rebelled had largely died out by the beginning of the book of Deuteronomy. Most of Deuteronomy is a sermon by Moses to prepare the younger generation to enter into the promised land. They are reminded of the covenant, the law. They are told what to do. They are reminded how God will help them. And at the end of the book, Moses dies. The book of Joshua picks up with the death of Moses and the appointment of a new leader of Israel. Joshua chapter 1, verse 1 says, Now after the death of Moses, the servant of the Lord, it came to pass that the Lord spake unto Joshua, the son of Nun, Moses' minister, saying, Moses, my servant, is dead. Now therefore arise, go over this Jordan now, and all this people unto the land which I do give to them, even to the children of Israel. Every place that the sole of your foot shall tread upon, that have I given unto you, as I said unto Moses. From the wilderness and this Lebanon, even unto the great river, the river Euphrates, all the land of the Hittites, and unto the great sea, toward the going down of the sun shall be your coast. There shall not be any man able to stand before thee all the days of thy life. As I was with Moses, so I will be with thee. I will not fail thee, nor forsake thee. Be strong and of good courage, for unto this people shalt thou divide an inheritance, the land, which I swear unto their fathers to give them. Joshua was chosen as the successor to Moses. He had been Moses' servant and right-hand man. We first see Joshua in Exodus chapter 17, verse 9. And Moses said unto Joshua, Choose out men, and go out, fight with Amalek. Tomorrow I will stand on the top of the hill with the rod of God in mine hand. So Joshua did as Moses had said to him, and fought with Amalek. And Moses, Aaron, and Hur went up to the top of the hill. And it came to pass, when Moses held up his hand, that Israel prevailed. And when he let down his hand, Amalek prevailed. But Moses' hands were heavy, and they took a stone and put it under him, and he sat thereon. And Aaron and Hur stayed up his hands, the one on the one side, and the other on the other side, and his hands were steady until the going down of the sun. And Joshua discomfited Amalek and his people with the edge of the sword. Joshua was chosen to lead the soldiers, and Moses stood as the prophet of God. Moses was the leader, but in battle it was Joshua that led the soldiers. Joshua was both a military leader and the assistant to Moses. And in that story we see Moses had that power given to him by God that as long as his arms were upraised, they would have victory. So the victory came because of God through his prophet Moses. But Joshua still had an important role as he did the physical leading of the actual battle. And it was Joshua that led them to victory over Amalek. So each one had their part. Moses had his role as a prophet. Joshua had his role as the general of the army. And of course, God is the one who gave them the victory overall. Joshua was chosen to lead. And he became a leader in a more diverse way. He was a political leader. He was a spiritual leader as well, even though he's not reckoned among the Levites. When Moses went to Mount Sinai, Joshua went with him. Though Joshua did not go all the way into the presence of God, he was there at Mount Sinai to assist Moses. Later on, Joshua was chosen to spy out the land of Canaan. 12 spies were sent into Canaan to represent the 12 tribes. 10 of the spies reported that the land was everything that God had promised, but that the people that lived in Canaan were giants living in walled cities, and it would be impossible to conquer. They recognized that everything was just as God had prophesied, but they didn't believe God's promise that he would give them the land. Instead, they saw it from a human perspective and decided it was too hard. Now, 2 of the spies argued that God had given them the land and it was everything God had promised. Therefore, if God had promised them there would be that way, and it was, then God promised them the victory and they would have the victory. The people sided with the 10 spies. And God declared that only the 2 spies from that generation, 2 men and their families from that generation, would enter into Canaan. And one of those 2 positive spies was Joshua. When Moses died, Joshua became the leader. Twice we are told that Moses was dead. This was a significant transition of leadership. Moses was the first true leader of the nation of Israel. They had never known anyone else. However, things were not going to stop just because Moses had died. The nation had to move on, and they were going to have to move quickly. Joshua was commanded to lead the people across the Jordan River. The Jordan River marked the boundary between the wilderness and the land of Canaan. The invasion was beginning. In issuing the invasion order, God reminded Joshua of some important promises. God promised that he would give all the land that they set foot on because of the promise he had given Moses. Deuteronomy chapter 11 verse 24 says, "Every place whereon the soles of your feet shall tread shall be yours. From the wilderness and Lebanon, from the river Euphrates, even unto the uttermost sea shall your coast be." God had promised that he would give the land of Canaan to the Israelites. This is a promise that was originally given to Abraham. Genesis 15:18. In the same day the Lord made a covenant with Abram, saying, Unto thy seed have I given this land, from the river of Egypt unto the great river, the river Euphrates. Canaan was promised to the descendants of Abraham. Now God was going to complete that promise. God also promised Joshua that victory was assured. The invasion of Canaan was a major undertaking. Israel was basically a group of nomadic tribes, but they were invading a land that was well defended and equipped. The Canaanites had built walled cities that were well fortified. In that time period, a walled city was extremely difficult to conquer. The militaries of that time lacked what's called siege-breaking technology. Later on, they would develop weapons that could smash through walls or overcome walls. But in this time period, you could try to assault a wall, but it was extremely difficult because they would fill the wall with archers and slingers who would take out your troops as they approached the wall. And as they approached the wall, they would have to use ladders to scale the wall, and that's just not the best way to do it. I mean, it's possible, but you have to have a huge, well-trained and well-equipped army to do so. And Israel lacked that. They lacked siege technology. Typically, the only way to overcome one of these cities was through a prolonged siege. You would simply surround the city and try to starve them out. There were instances where armies would use deception to breach a city. Famously, one of the stories about a walled city being breached through treachery is the story of the Iliad by Homer, the Greek story of how the Greeks conquered the city of Troy. And they were not able to breach the walls. Instead, they fought the armies of Troy outside the walls, and they could not ever get to the walls. They had to rely upon a deception crafted by Odysseus, and of course we know that story is the Trojan horse, and that's how they were able to breach the walls of Troy, because it was a time period when the Greeks lacked siege technology, as far as siege-breaking walls and such. So, typically you would surround a city, and you would just try to outlast them. The people in the city would have their supplies of food and water, and you would just simply have to outlast them. Well, Israel lacked the supplies. Now, God would provide, of course, but they lacked the material supplies and resources for a prolonged siege like that. On paper, the Israelites could not conquer the cities. They didn't possess the technology or skill. Additionally, the Canaanite cities had been allies with the Egyptians and at various times with the Hittites as well. And both of those were superior military forces. They possessed chariots, which were the most powerful weapon system of the day. The Israelites were numerous, but they lacked the military tools, resources, and experience to overcome the Canaanites. The Canaanites were larger in stature and natural strength. On paper, it would seem impossible for the Israelites to triumph, and by human standards, it was impossible. History is filled with stories of military invasions that were determined by human strength and ingenuity. Additionally, the resolve and courage of the individual soldiers also plays into the chance of victory. In June 1944, the Allies were preparing to stage the largest military invasion in the history of the world. The Allies, or I should say it was the largest sea assault invasion in the history of the world. The Allies had been planning the invasion for several years. They had initiated amazing reconnaissance. They developed specialized tools and tactics to assault the beach, and they engaged in elaborate deceptions. They created a giant ruse of a false army stationed in England under the command of Patton. The Germans had a huge respect for General Patton, and they were sure that he would lead the invasion force at the Pas de Calais. The Allies wanted them to believe that, and that was the entire deception. They went through an elaborate deception. They even planted false documents on a dead body and positioned it to wash up in the Mediterranean and fall into German hands, just to confuse and make them think that Pas de Calais was the assault point. In reality, it was Normandy. But the Allies went to extreme lengths. Thousands of ships, hundreds of thousands of men were involved in the attack. but they were facing battle-hardened troops in fixed fortifications. Germany's most brilliant general had prepared the defenses of the beach, and had he been given full control, it is very possible that Germany could have repelled the assault. The outcome of the invasion of Normandy was far from certain on June 6, 1944. Eisenhower was well aware that defeat was possible. Prior to the invasion, Eisenhower wrote out a letter of apology and resignation in case the invasion failed. Fortunately, the invasion was a success, and Ike went on to lead the Allies to final victory over the Axis powers. Now, as Joshua stood looking over the Jordan River, he had no such worries. There was no doubt in his mind that there would be victory. God had promised that no force could stand against them. Now, it was not because of the quality of the Israelite forces, but because God would give them the victory. He promised that no force would stand against Israel. This was a promise that he had earlier given to Moses. Deuteronomy chapter 11, verse 25. There shall no man be able to stand before you, for the Lord your God shall lay the fear of you and the dread of you upon all the land that ye shall tread upon, as he has said unto you. As long as the Israelites were obedient to the covenant and followed God, then God would give them victory. Within a short time, fear would spread throughout Canaan because they recognized that God was fighting for Israel. That fear had already fallen upon the land before the Israelites even crossed the Jordan. And when they crossed the Jordan, the miraculous way in which they did was seen by the people in Canaan, and it terrified them. Later, Rahab would tell the spies in Jericho, look, we know what you did to the kings on the other side of the river. We know how you crossed the Jordan, and God is with you. Who can stand against that? And she sided with the Israelites. God would fulfill the promises he had given, and Canaan would be given to Israel. Even with all these promises, it was still a monumental moment for Joshua. He was stepping into the shoes of Moses. No matter how qualified and prepared an individual may be, it can still be overwhelming to take the place of a revered leader. Imagine for a moment a church that has been led by a pastor for 30 or 40 years. That pastor has married or buried someone from every family in the church. Following such a pastor would be extremely difficult. Unfortunately, everyone would compare the new guy to the previous pastor, and oftentimes not in a favorable light. Typically, the pastor that follows a legacy pastor does not last very long. He is unable to match up to his predecessor and not given time to establish his own ministry within the church. People typically don't have long enough memories to remember that legacy pastor, a pastor who'd been there for over 15 years, had his struggles in the beginning as well. Every minister, when he comes to a church, goes through a learning process and has to learn and how to deal with that church and how to best minister there. And sometimes it takes a little while for him to get into position and to do what needs to be done within that church. And given time, if a pastor is following the leadership of God, he will meet the needs of that fellowship, and God can help them prosper. But a lot of times, new guys following these big long-term pastors are not given that opportunity to establish their own ministry. It's part of human nature that people will be critical. You can look through, again, in political history. Look at the presidency of Truman. People loved FDR. And even though Truman continued many of the policies that FDR had, he wasn't Roosevelt. And when things didn't always work out, they blamed Truman. And the interesting thing is, Roosevelt's term in office was extremely difficult, especially the first 8 years. And some would argue he was in battle his entire time. But people forget that. After he died, they all talked about how wonderful FDR was. Now, I'm not siding on either side. I'm just saying that's a historical fact. Truman was always in the shadow of FDR and never could live up to public expectations. And that's why he didn't win a second term in office. That happens in politics, it happens in business, it happens in the church. We should be careful about that, to let people lead as God has shown them. As long as they're being obedient to God, they should be given a chance to lead if they've been called to that position. Now, God told Joshua not to worry about such matters. Joshua 1:7, "Only be thou strong and very courageous, that thou mayest observe to do according to all the law which Moses my servant commanded thee. Turn not from it to the right hand or to the left, that thou mayest prosper whithersoever thou goest. This book of the law shall not depart out of thy mouth, but thou shalt meditate therein day and night, that thou mayest observe to do according to all that is written therein. For then shalt thou make thy way prosperous, and then thou shalt have good success." God instructed Joshua to be strong and courageous, but also to observe the law. Throughout the Bible, proper leadership is connected with obedience to God. You can read through 1st and 2nd Kings and Chronicles, and every king is evaluated on whether or not they were obedient to the law and followed God. Good kings were obedient to the law, but those that forsook God and followed after idols and the ways of the world were failures. Obedience to God comes through knowing His law. God had revealed Himself to humanity through the scriptures that He had given. He had just given Israel the first 5 books of the Bible. They were the foundation of all Scripture and the beginning of God's ultimate revelation. I don't know why that's a tongue twister, but it is God's ultimate revelation. God instructed Joshua to not only obey the law, but to cherish and incorporate the law into his whole life. Joshua was to constantly meditate upon the law in order that he might know the right path in every instance. The idea of meditating on the law has been likened to a cow chewing cud. In fact, he says to have it in your mouth, to have the law in your mouth. That's not just speaking it. Typically, the Jewish tradition of meditating upon the law is to kind of murmur the words of Scripture over and over again, reciting the Bible verse to yourself. And typically when someone would read or recite the Bible, they would do it out loud. So it's kind of a constant recitation of memory verses. And the idea is not just to recite them, but to think about them, like a cow chewing the grass, constantly chewing it. And for Scripture, we're constantly meditating on it, thinking it, digesting it until it becomes a part of us. Rather than relying on human opinion, a good leader looks to God and meditates on the Scriptures that God has given. Joshua 1:9 says, "Have not I commanded thee? Be strong and of a good courage. Be not afraid, neither be thou dismayed, for the Lord thy God is with thee whithersoever thou goest." God finished his command to Joshua by reiterating the charge to be strong and courageous. Joshua had no need to fear because God would be with him. When we look at the book of Joshua, it would appear that Joshua believed the words of God. He was a strong and courageous man that did walk in the ways of God. God calls all believers to obedience and service. He will enable and equip those that he has called to service. Psalm 118:6 says, "The Lord is on my side, I will not fear. What can man do unto me?" Romans 8:31, "What shall we say then to these things? If God be for us, who can be against us?" We don't have to rely upon our own abilities and talents. God often uses those who are least qualified to achieve his will. The important thing, whether we are a leader or a worker, is that we are obedient to God. In the church, we must also acknowledge that God has called men to be leaders and women as well. God has called both to be leaders within the church in various roles. As long as a leader is following Scripture and they've been called by God, it would be a dangerous thing to reject their leadership. God holds leaders accountable to do his will, but he also holds those who follow or fail to follow accountable as well. We have all been called to serve in some capacity, and God has given us the abilities and skills to do whatever task he has set before us. Again, we are not relying upon our own abilities. God sometimes chooses people, and often chooses people, who are not able to do it on their own strength so that it will demonstrate that God is the one behind it. I remember reading a book by a pastor in Atlanta. It's actually a Presbyterian pastor. And he was talking about they were setting goals for their church, and he said he wanted them to set impossible goals. He wanted them to pray about and see where God was leading them, and then set goals that were not humanly achievable. The reason is he wanted everybody to understand that the church had not accomplished these things, but rather God had accomplished it through them. Understand, sometimes God is calling you to do something great, and you think it's impossible. Then sometimes that's the exact place you're supposed to be. Because God's called you to achieve the impossible not on your own power, but by the power of God. When God shows you what needs to be done, He will give you the strength to accomplish His will. Be strong, be courageous, be obedient. The hymn that I'm going to sing is by Ernest Shurtleff. The hymn is entitled Lead On, O King Eternal. Ernest Shurtleff was about to graduate from Andover Seminary in 1887. His classmates knew that he was a poet. He had actually already published some poetry, and some of his classmates approached him and said, "Ernest, why don't you write our class a poem? After all, you've already published 2 volumes of poetry. What's the use of having a distinguished author in the class if he cannot rise to the occasion and to do his class the honor of writing a good poem just for them?" "Let's make it a hymn that we can all sing," replied Shurtleff. "We've been spending days of preparation here at seminary. Now the day of March has come, and we must go out to follow the leadership of the King of Kings to conquer the world under his banner." The hymn, though, is good for more than just people in seminary or graduating from seminary. It's really good for all Christians, and it has that same idea in it that was given to Joshua of go forth, be obedient, be strong and courageous, and conquer for the kingdom. So the hymn is Lead On, O King Eternal. Lead on, O King Eternal, the day of March has come. Henceforth in fields of conquest thy tent shall be our home. Through days of preparation thy grace has made us strong, and now, O King Eternal, we lift our battle song. Lead on, O King Eternal, till sin's fierce war shall cease, and holiness shall whisper the sweet amen of peace. For not with swords loud clashing or stirring drums, with deeds of love and mercy, the heavenly kingdom comes. Lead on, O King Eternal, we follow not with fears, for gladness breaks like morning where thy face appears. Thy cross is lifted o'er us, we journey in its light. The crown awaits the conquest. Lead on, O King of might. Thank you for watching. I pray that this lesson has been informative and a blessing. Please share this lesson with others, and if you are able, I would like to invite you to join us at Ebenezer Baptist Church. Ebenezer Baptist Church is located at 7305 Highway 166 in Douglasville, Georgia. Sunday school is at 9:45 a.m. and morning worship is at 11 a.m. We also have an evening worship service on Sundays at 6 p.m. We have a weekly prayer meeting at 7 on Wednesdays. Additionally, if you have any questions about the lesson or have any prayer requests, please email me at pastorterrybraswell@gmail.com. Thank you.